This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this tutorial we're going to study Lesson 12 in Classical Grammar and look at the participles. This is a lesson that can cause students some trouble, so I'd like to walk through it and try to help you study this lesson and master the content as easily as possible. So let's go ahead and get started studying Lesson 12 on the participles. In Article 119, we read what we can consider a definition of a participle, and this is likely the most important article in Lesson 12, the definition of a participle. The article reads, "A participle is a verbal adjective differing from other adjectives by carrying with it a notion of time." A participle is a verbal adjective differing from other adjectives by carrying with it a notion of time. This definition tells us two important things. It tells us what a participle is, namely that it's an adjective, a certain kind of adjective. It's a verbal adjective. And it tells us how a participle differs from other adjectives. It differs from other adjectives by carrying with it a notion of time. It expresses the notion or idea of time. So a participle is used in speech like an adjective noun. A participle is used like an adjective noun. What's different about it, though, is that it also shares in the characteristics of a verb. It's like a verb. It's a verbal adjective. It carries with it a notion of time. So let's consider an example. On your slide in yellow, you can see 4 examples of participles that are underlined. The first is running in running water. The second is living in living soul. The third is broken in broken window, and lastly, whipped in whipped cream. So here we have 4 examples of participles, and what I'd like you to see is that they're like adjectives. For example, in the phrase running water, we can replace running with a simple adjective like hot or cold. Hot water, cold water, running water. We can see that a participle is used just like an adjective noun. In the second example, we see living in living soul. The participles in running water and living soul are both present tense participles. They carry a notion of the present time. Running water, water that is running. A living soul, a soul that is living. They carry the idea of present time. In the third example, we read broken in broken window. And again, we can see that broken is used just like an adjective. We could replace broken with clean window or clear window. So broken, being a participle, works just like an adjective, but broken suggests the idea of past time. The window has been broken. The window was broken. It is a broken window. The participle broken carries the notion of past time. Lastly, we see whipped in whipped cream. Whipped is used like an adjective. and it expresses the idea of past time. So the first two examples are present tense participles, and the second two, broken and whipped, are past tense participles. We can see that they're all used just like adjective nouns, but they carry a notion of time. They're verbal adjectives. They're participles. In Article 120, we learn that there are two kinds of participles used in English. Article 120 reads, "We have in English only two participles formed by inflection, the present and the past participle." We have in English only two participles formed by inflection, the present and the past participle. The reason why this article says only two is because in Latin there are more than two. There are four participles. In English we have only two participles formed by inflection. And what formed by inflection means is that these participles are expressed by changing the forms of words. So we have in English only two participles that are formed by inflection, and they are the present and the past participle. We can see an example of these two kinds of participles by looking back at the examples we looked at in Article 119. We have in English only two participles formed by inflection, the present participle and the past participle. And notice that in the rule there, I put present in yellow and past in blue. And on the right, if we look at the examples, you can see the first two examples, which are examples of present participles. They're in yellow. And below that, we have two blue participles, and they're examples of past participles. So running and living are examples of present participles. Broken and whipped are example of past participles. In Article 121, we read, "The present participle ends in ng and has an active meaning." The present participle ends in ng and has an active meaning. So it's easy for us to identify the present participle in English because the present participle ends in ng. Let's take a look at the examples again. In the two yellow participles, which are present participles, notice that the ending is ng, just as Article 121 tells us. I've put a pink circle around the endings, ng in running and ng in living. You can see that the present participle ends in ng, and it has an active meaning. The water is running. The soul is living. There's an active meaning, and these are present participles. We can identify them very easily because they end in ng in English. Rule number 122 can be quite difficult, so study this article carefully. Let's read Article 122 together. The past participle mostly ends in D or T or N. The past participle mostly, not always, but mostly ends in D, T, or N. And it has a passive meaning when the verb is a transitive verb. The past participle mostly ends in D, T, or N and has a passive meaning when the verb is transitive. Let's take a look at the examples to see exactly what this article is telling us. If we look at the examples of the past participles in blue on the right, you can see that broken ends in the letter N, just as the rule says, and whipped ends in a D, just as the rule says. And I've got those circled with pink circles. So we can see that the past participle mostly, again, not always, but most of the time, ends in D, T, or N. We see that in broken and whipped. The rule also tells us that the past participle has a passive meaning when the verb is transitive. Now, the verb break is transitive. The word or the verb whip is also transitive. So when we read broken window, it has a passive meaning. The window has been broken. Whipped is another example of a past participle when the verb is transitive. Whipped cream is passive. The cream has been whipped. So we see in these two examples the past participle mostly ends in D, T, or N and has a passive meaning when the verb is transitive. The rule then goes on to say, it is then no further expressive of a past time than as an action suffered is generally a completed action. So what that's simply saying is, when we look at the phrase broken window, it has the idea that the window has been broken. The window is presently broken, but the participle expresses an action that has been completed. The window has been broken. The cream is whipped. The cream has been whipped. So these past participles, when the verb is transitive, express an action that is suffered by the object and is a completed action. In Article 122, we talked about past participles that are formed from transitive verbs. Here in Article 123, we learn about the past participle that is derived from or formed from an intransitive verb. So you can see that to understand participles, you have to make sure that you understand transitive and intransitive verbs. If you don't remember what transitive and intransitive verbs are, you should take a little while at this point in the lesson, go back to those past verb lessons, learn about transitive and intransitive verbs if you've forgotten, and then come back and pick up this lesson and it'll be clearer for you. We read here in Article 123 that the past participle of an intransitive verb has an active meaning and expresses past time. So let's take a look at two examples, and I've had to write new examples because the other examples of past participles were drawn from transitive verbs, and Article 123 has to do with past participles drawn from intransitive verbs. So we have two examples here in blue on the right. A rested child. The verb rest is an intransitive verb, and we can form a past participle from that verb rested, the rested child. And the second example is a grown man. To grow is an intransitive verb. Grown is a past participle drawn from the verb to grow. So we have rested child and grown man, two examples of past participles that are drawn from intransitive verbs. And what Article 123 tells us is that these will have an active meaning and they will express past time. So in the previous article, we learned that past participles of transitive verbs have a passive meaning, like the broken window, the window that was broken by someone else or something else. It's passive. But these past participles, because they're formed from intransitive verbs, they have an active meaning. So let's take a look. The rested child is not a child who has been rested by someone else. A rested child is a child who has himself rested. It's active. Even though it's a past participle, it's an active meaning. The rested child, the child who has rested. And secondly, the grown man, the man who has grown. So these are examples of past participles of intransitive verbs that have an active meaning and express past time. In Article 124, we read more about past participles and how they're used to form other expressions in English. So let's read Article 124. The past participles of both transitive and intransitive verbs are used with have to form some of the compound tenses of the active voice. The past participles of both transitive and intransitive verbs are used with have to form some of the compound tenses of the active voice. So participles, once we learn participles, we can use participles to form other expressions. So we read here that participles, past participles, are used with the verb have to form compound tenses in the active voice for verbs. And we have three examples. I have loved. We see have, the verb, and then we see the past participle loved in blue. We then see I have run, and we have the verb have with the participle run. And then we see I have written. We have the verb have in pink, and then the participle written in blue. So we see the participles being joined to the verb have to form compound tenses of verbs. So it's important for us to know that when we learn how to use participles, we can not only use them by themselves, but we'll also use them to form other expressions with other verbs. At this point in the lesson, I believe that Article 125 is pretty simple. It reads, the present participle is formed by adding the termination ing to the verb. The present participle is formed by adding the termination ing to the verb. And we can see this in the two examples of present participles that we've looked at, running water and living soul. We can see, generally speaking, that we take the verb run and add ing. We take the verb live and add ing, and this is how we form the present participle. Now, in both of those examples, in running and in living, you'll see that it's not so simple as to just stick ing on at the end. There are some changes that sometimes need to be made, and the small notes here, A, B, and C, explain some of the changes that need to be made, and you can read those on your own, but you can see in these examples how it's not that simple. We don't just stick ing on the end of a verb. There are some changes that sometimes need to be made. So that's Article 125, very simple, and 3 notes about some changes that need to be made when forming present participles. In Article 125, if you look at the notes that come after the main text of the article, you'll see that it talks about how in some verbs the last syllable is accented, and when that happens, we usually double the consonant at the end of the verb when we form the present participle. And I know this may be difficult to listen to, but the note simply talked about how for some verbs, when the last syllable is accented, we need to double the consonant before we add ing. Well, in Article 126, we're learning that in some places we don't need to double the consonant. So, Article 126 reads, "It is better not to double the final consonant when a termination like the ing ending, when a termination is added to a word that is not accented on the last syllable." So if we have a verb that's made up of more than one syllable and it's not accented on the last syllable, we usually don't double the consonant at the end of the verb when we form the present participle. And that's a lot to think about, but let's look at the example because it makes the rule clear for us. In the first example, we see gardening gloves. Gardening gloves. The verb is to garden. To work in the garden, we say, is to garden. The accent is on the first syllable, garden. So if we want to form the present participle, we simply add ing to the verb garden. And because the accent in garden is not on the last syllable, but on the first syllable, we don't double the consonant at the end of the word when we make the present participle. We spell gardening with just one N before ing. That's what Article 126 is teaching us. Another example would be simmering pot. If a pot is left on the stove to cook slowly, we say it is a simmering pot. The verb simmer has an accent on the first syllable, not on the last syllable, so the consonant at the end of the verb, the R, is not doubled when we add ing. It is better not to double the final consonant when a termination is added to a word that is not accented on the last syllable. Here in Article 127 we read, when the preterite or past tense of a verb is formed by the addition of d or ed, the same form serves also for the past participle. Let's read that again. When the preterite is formed by the addition of d or ed to the present tense of the verb, the same form serves also for the past participle. So again, let's look at some examples. If we take the verb to rest, to lie down and rest, we form the preterite by adding ed. So the present tense is rest, the past tense is rested. That form that's made by adding ed to make the preterite tense is the same form that's used also for the past participle. So rested here, a rested child. A child after taking a nap is a rested child. The same form that's used for the preterite tense of the verb is used for the past participle, rested. Another example would be cook. To cook something, the present tense, we make it preterite by adding ed, cooked. Last night, I cooked dinner. That's how we form the preterite tense. We add ed to cook. Well, when the preterite is formed by the addition of d or ed, as in cooked, the same form serves also for the past participle. So these preterite verb forms, rested and cooked, also serve as the past participle. The last article in Lesson 12 is Article 128. This article reads, when the preterite is formed by changing the vowel sound of the present tense verb, the past participle regularly ends in en, but is often of the same form with the preterite. When the preterite is formed by changing the vowel sound of the present, the past participle regularly ends in en. So we have to think of some examples where the preterite form of a verb is formed by changing the vowel sound of the present tense verb. And on the right, you can see two examples of this. First, we have the present tense verb speak. And to form the preterite form from the verb speak, we change the vowel sound. So the present tense is speak, the preterite tense is spoke. When the preterite is formed by changing the vowel sound, like speak to spoke, the past participle regularly ends in en, like spoken. Another example is the verb weave. To weave means to make cloth, usually to make a blanket or some clothing. Weave is the present tense. The past tense is wove. When the preterite is formed by changing the vowel sound of the present, like from weave to wove, the past participle regularly ends in en, like woven. So here we see two examples of this situation in Article 128 when the preterite is formed by changing the vowel sound of the present tense verb, how the past participle is formed for such verbs. In this tutorial, we've looked at the participles in Lesson 12 of Classical Grammar. I hope that this tutorial is helpful and that it will help you to learn this lesson easily and carefully. If you have any questions about this lesson, please contact me and let me know so I can offer more help. For more resources from the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, visit classicalliberalarts.com. God bless your studies.